Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today we're going to learn more about John and his sister Julia from her book, Imagine This. I'm glad we get to see another view of John through her eyes, and I'm glad there's so much material that we can discover to bring us more into the Beatles and how they've lived their lives. It makes their music even more special that way. So this episode, A New House, Julia remembered that Pop, that was Mimi and Julia's dad, died, and that shortly after he passed away, the owner decided he wanted to sell the property. Well, Julia and John Dykins, who she called Bobby, were given the option to buy the house, but they couldn't afford to buy. That meant they needed to find a place to rent quickly. They knew they needed a bigger place than the one they had had before they moved in with Pops. Julia was pregnant, and there was Julia, little Julia, and John would come to visit too. They ended up moving to a pre-war council house on Springwood Estate in Allerton. When Julia gave birth to a girl, they named her Jackie. All the family came to visit, but the only ones who didn't were Aunt Mimi and John. So John was 8 years old at the time, and Mimi felt that Dykins and Julia living arrangement was unsuitable for John. Now they were living a little further from Penny Lane, so Mimi felt that she could lay down the law. Also, Pops wasn't around to sway her. To Mimi, Julia and Dykins were living in sin, and that their daughters Julia and Jackie were illegitimate, therefore they weren't in the family. So Mimi stated that John would not go to their house to see his mother's union, nor to see the illegitimate children, and Mimi felt that John seeing his mother upset him. Mimi thought that it would be the way she said, but Julia didn't want to give up on John, and she was going to see him with or without Mimi's permission, and John felt the same way. So Julia would visit. Julia's daughter said that Julia would go to Aunt Mimi's uninvited and unwelcome to see her son. There were times that Mimi wouldn't open the door, and Julia would return to her home and cry. And she had a record which went, "My son John, to me you are so wonderful. My son John, to me you are the world." And she wore that record out. And from August 1949 to April 1950, John didn't visit their house. He was only able to see his mom when Mimi let Julia in, and that wasn't too often. Stanley Sutherland, John's cousin, he was the one that got John to Julia's house. He was 16 when he paid a visit. He was living in Scotland, but he came down to visit the family. And he went to Mimi's house one day and said he wanted to take John to see his mother. And Mimi said not to let Julia see him. Stanley said he would take him to his aunt's, but he took John to Julia's to see everyone. And Julia was so happy, and Stanley told John not to tell Mimi. Julia, little Julia, was 3 at the time, and she didn't know that John's visit was the big secret. She remembered John would eat with them and play with them, and he hugged Julia and laughed and cried with her. When Stanley went back to his home in Scotland, John could only go to see Julia at her home rarely. And when John was 10, he went to see her when he was supposed to be working as a Cub Scout for a bob-a-week job. And he usually had to wait till Mimi let Julia in, or he would meet her at Nanny's. John's summer holidays were spent in Edinburgh so that he and Julia could be separated. His sister said she was forever trying to understand that. John's sister remembered that John was like a ghost in their house. She loved her daughters and missed her son. So then John got to see his mom. John was 11, and he asked Mimi again if he could see his mother, and she, of course, said no. So when John turned 12, John started to go to the Quarrybank Boys Grammar School. John, when he got out of school, was able to visit his mother without Mimi knowing it. He rode the bus over. His sister said that it was like a triangle, Mendips on one corner, Quarrybank on the other, and Julia's house at the third. John's sister said he would see Julia after school or would not go to school to see her. So it was a thrill for both John and Julia, and John's sister remembered the laughter and could feel their joy. In 1954, John was 13 and was getting too old to be kept away from his mother, and he would see his mom as much as he dared to. He was encouraged by Dykins and Julia. When Mimi realized that she couldn't keep John away from Julia's house, she began to let Julia come to her house and visit. And John's sister remembers playing in the garden, and Julia and Mimi sat on the grass drinking tea. That summer, John's sister said that she remembered seeing John a lot, and she said when they went to Mimi's house, she could read and draw with John in his bedroom, and they made paper skeletons and hung them from the ceiling to scare Mimi. They thought that was funny. John took Sister Julia to the Wasteland, which is what they called it, at the end of the row of houses to show her where he played cricket with Pete Shotton and Ivan Vaughan. Mimi and Julia became closer again, and Julia was so happy with John at her house when he came to visit. When John turned 14, Bobby Dykins made him a cake with orange and lemon peel, and that was Dykins' specialty. They had birthday tea in the kitchen, and Julia and John played instruments and they danced. So now we come to Julia and Bobby. John's sister said that they had a happy home, and there were times her parents quarreled, of course. No marriage is perfect. Little Julia always remembered her mother being in the kitchen when she and her sister came home from school. Her mother would be singing in the kitchen, and Julia was a good cook, but she did simple things like stews and roast, and Dykins would make cakes and puddings. Julia didn't see the point of housework, and when Dykins wanted to get a washing machine, she didn't want one because she would rather take the laundry to the Chinese laundry. So John's sister said that Julia always had time for her and her sister. She was an artist and an entertainer. When she was outside the house, she would ride a bicycle with her feet in the air, run races, skip, juggle with 3 balls, do headstands, handstands, the upside-down crab, and cartwheels. And when they were inside the house, Julia would draw, paint, sing, dance, and play instruments. She played the banjo, the ukulele, the piano, and the piano accordion. John's sister said they spent hours dancing as she played and sang to them. Julia wasn't vain, but she cared about her looks and her appearance. She wore bright red nail polish on her toes and her hands, and she gave herself oatmeal face mask, and she kept her hands white with lemon juice. She took brewer's yeast tablets for her complexion, and Dykins loved her. He was stylish in his way, too. He had a camel-haired coat and a brown trilby. Dykins would work in the evenings because he was a waiter, so little Julia and Jackie didn't get to see him for days at a time. So he was there when they had breakfast, but he was gone when they came back from school, and he usually had to work on the weekends, and on his days off, he would play with them and cook them treats, and he loved to be in the kitchen. John and Bobby got along well together. John called him Bobby, but to his friends he called Bobby Twitchy because of his nervous little cough. Bobby gave John pocket money when he came over, and they would joke and play together. And one time Bobby got mad at John because John was smoking in his room and he accidentally set fire to his mattress. He yelled at John that he could have burnt the house down, and John apologized in his teenage way. When John stayed over, little Julia and Jackie wouldn't leave him alone. They would jump on him, they would play games. They thought he was wonderful fun. So John's friends and his sister's friends would often ask John why he was living with his aunt when his mother was just down the road. So John didn't have an answer to it. One day, John's sister heard her father and John talking, and Dykins said to John that he could stay if he wanted to. He helped John's shoulders and said, "You don't have to go, John." He said he could go and talk to Mimi and get things straightened out once and for all. So John was 14 at this time, and John had been coming to visit more often than before, but going back at the end of the day stressed him out. John cried and told Dykins, I can't, I'll be in so much trouble. I've got to go, but I'm going to stay all summer." Well, his plan didn't work out. He didn't get to do as he planned because he was sent to Scotland to see his aunt and her family. And that was the last summer trip to Scotland because the aunt sort of ignored John while he was there. Uncle George, Mimi's husband, died around this time. He was quiet around the house, as John's sister remembered, because of the hours he worked. He was either going to bed or in the bed when Julia and her daughters visited. He never said a bad word, and he and John always had little secrets between them, and he would give John kisses at bedtime. Uncle George and John were allies. She thought that John was upset by his death because he was like a father figure. John couldn't show his emotions publicly, and when George died, he and his cousin went upstairs and laughed and laughed. He said he felt guilty afterwards because he cared very much for George, but he couldn't show it. He said George had been exceptionally kind to him. John's sister didn't know how Mimi was dealing with things. She was more involved in her own home. So Dykins came home with an LP one night. He brought home an Elvis Presley album. They listened to Hound Dog and Heartbreak Hotel. Julia was crazy about Elvis. She danced with Dykins, John, and her niece when she was with them, and she said her parents were good dancing partners. They went and did Latin American dancing in town. They loved the tango and the rumba. Julia loved Elvis, but her most played song was the one entitled My son John, to me you are so wonderful. When John became a teen and spent more time with Julia, she started to teach him music. She taught him how to play the banjo that had belonged to his grandfather. Julia also had a record of That'll Be the Day by Buddy Holly. It was the first song that Julia taught him to play. John said Julia was patient as he learned the chords, and she was a perfectionist. She made him go through it over and over till it was right. Julia played the ukulele, but John's sister said that she didn't remember John wanting to learn it. Julia could play it well. She loved that performer entertainer George Formby that played the ukulele, and she was like George Harrison because he liked him too. So John's sister said she didn't think Julia could read music, but she could play by ear. At this time, skiffle was becoming popular. Everyone was going crazy over it, especially in Liverpool. And John started to practice music more and more. When John got the quarrymen together, they would go into the bathroom to play it, to give it a booming echo. It was at this time that John needed to wear glasses, and so did John's sister. Julia cried when she learned her daughter needed glasses because Julia herself was short-sighted. She never wore glasses, so her daughter didn't know how she managed to see without wearing them. Now, this is a shocking part of the book that I found out. So Mimi was carrying a secret. Nanny told John's sister that she felt that Mimi had a lover, but she thought it was someone in New Zealand, but it was really at her own home in Mendips that the affair happened. Mimi and Uncle George took in tenants for extra money, and they were usually medical students. And one student was at Mendips for 9 years. His name was Michael Fishwick. He was at the house from 1951 to 1960. John's sister tracked him down to talk to him. Michael at the time was studying to be a doctor, and when he moved in the house, Uncle George was still alive. After George died in 1955, Michael returned to Mendips, and this time it was just John and Mimi living there. They developed a close friendship, and a year later they began an affair. Mimi told him she was 46, but she was really 50, and he was 24. He said that Mimi was a virgin when they began their affair. George and Mimi had never consummated the marriage. Michael thought that Mimi was an attractive woman. Michael told John's sister that they had clicked as intellectual friends from the start. And Nanny had some of the story right, that they were thinking of going to New Zealand. Mimi was now in the situation that Julia had been in. She was living with her lover and John under the same roof, and she didn't want to end the affair or to give up John. In 1957, Michael Fishwick was offered a 3-year research post in New Zealand. He told Mimi, and she jumped at the chance to go with him. Mimi knew John would want to move in with his mother and stepfather and sisters permanently, and at this point she was ready to let him go to be with Michael. The plan never came through because the funding for Michael's research was refused. That meant he could no longer be exempt from national service, and he left Mendips a few months later and joined up. Michael told John's sister that had they gone to New Zealand, marriage would have probably been a possibility, and he probably would have regretted it because he wouldn't have been able to have kids. He would return at regular intervals to Mendips, but after the postgraduate post didn't work out and the death of his mother, the romance came to an end. They would become friends, and he married someone else in 1960. Well, needless to say, John's sister was shocked to hear the news. Mimi had condemned Julia for what she was doing, and she was doing the same thing. And John's sister said that when Mimi was on her deathbed, she said about herself that she was a wicked woman. So I will end with this shocking detail and continue in the next episode of John's sister and her remembrances. It's certainly been insightful, and we can see how upset Julia was being separated from John, and how both John and Julia found ways to be together. I'm glad they could do that since their years together were cut short with her tragic death. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.